the Manchester that I grew up in was truly, truly appalling, I can tell you. We were all on our knees, we really were. You know, these foreign, these aid organizations like Save the Children, you know what Save the Children was formed to do? To save me. It was formed to save European children. The big problem after the Second World War was how to get Europe back on its feet again. And of course the Marshall Plan that the Americans eventually hit on, pumping some of their money into Europe and Japan, was one of the principal causes of this renewal. And of course the Korean War, which was a hot war with the Russians and the Chinese in Korea, that more than anything stimulated demand again. War stimulated demand for metals and for various kinds of manufactures, and the world economy started picking up then on a combination of rebuilding a shattered Japan and Western Europe and essentially reviving the war economy in some way or another. And Schumpeter then began to look like a prophet, because he had said that there is this tremendous opportunity for capitalist development based on the fact that the economy has been wiped out so thoroughly. That means there's all this stuff to build again, and so capitalism is based on profit, pursuing profit in the rebuilding of a society. I mean, this was really the theory in Iraq. You know, that American capitalism will get a shot in the arm from displacing Saddam, going in there and rebuilding the place. It hasn't actually sort of worked that way yet. So this was the context then within which, first in Asia and then in Africa and other parts of the colonial empires, the non-Western peoples began to make an appeal for their own emancipation and to join world society as equals. And there are two aspects of this period after 1945. The first one is that society everywhere was radicalized by the war. I mean, this was the context in which a Labour Party in Britain won a 3-to-1 majority on a program that included the nationalization of the means of finance as its first item. They were going to nationalize the banks, the building societies, absolutely, and insurance companies, everything. They were going to nationalize the railways, they were going to nationalize education, they were going to nationalize everything. And the people who had fought the war, my parents and their generation, they voted 3-to-1 for that program. Winston Churchill, who had been a hero in the war, in fighting the Nazis, was just thrown out. Just like that, no sentimentality. So the first point is, there was a genuine, radical social impulse to rebuild society on a global scale, on a sounder footing than before, on the basis of having defeated fascism. And the second aspect of it was that the economy as a whole was profoundly depressed. And people were extremely uncertain about the future, and they weren't sure whether perhaps a socialist and planned command economy might actually offer a better bet than a capitalism that really looked to have ruined the world in the previous 50 years. So this was the context of development in its contemporary sense as an alliance between rich and poor countries, so that the rich would help the poor to become richer, with the idea that when they became richer, they would in some ways stimulate demand within the world economy and help the richer countries to get back on their feet as well. There would be more people, the more money that people... Remember how Keynes had solved the problem to some extent of the Great Depression. The market had failed miserably, so governments started printing money that they could put into people's pockets that regenerated demand. And so the same question of the regeneration of demand on a global scale was the principal priority in the post-war situation. Now, I would argue that the period since, let's say, 1950 to 2000, that 50-year period, the second half of the 20th century, that period of 50 years can be divided into two periods, with the 1970s as the transition between them. So what I'm going to suggest is that the development scenario has changed dramatically. The relationship between rich and poor countries has changed a lot in this 50-year period, so that I would claim that in the 50s and 60s, there was a genuine attempt to achieve development in the first sense of economic growth for the poor countries. And in the 80s and 90s, that has been put into reverse. There is no longer any serious attempt to develop the poor countries in that sense. But there is a concern with development in the second sense of what can be done to prevent the continuing impoverishment of most of the people on the planet from actually disturbing society on a global scale. And indeed, in this period of the 80s and the 90s, the transfer of income, just the sheer money transferred from poor countries to rich countries, has been on a larger scale than ever achieved in any of the previous periods of the relationship between the West and the rest. And this has taken form mainly of debt repayments and interest payments caused by the economic crisis of the 1970s. So what I'm arguing is that there was a period from the 50s, in the 50s and 60s, in which the world economy was growing. It was, and especially the Western industrial countries found that they could engineer a significant economic growth through expanding their public sectors at the same time and trading with each other, principally. So this created the kind of increased affluence that I grew up with, that I took for granted when I was a child, a teenager, a student, that the world was going through this period of unprecedented economic growth and expansion, at least where we were looking at it from. This was also a period in which the principal states had great legitimacy. The state as an organization was highly legitimate. Citizens looked to their government basically for the economic initiatives that would secure their prosperity. I mean, by the time that I began as a young adult working in the Third World, I mean, say around 1970, there wasn't anybody anywhere who thought that the free market was a solution to the problem of development. Everyone, whether they were Marxist or Keynesian or whatever, they all assumed that only the state, only the government had the resources to lift societies towards a higher level of economic achievement. That was a universal assumption then. And in the course of the 1970s, it was undermined. It was undermined by several things. The first was the oil price rise of 1973 and a subsequent one of 1979. This oil price rise took a lot of economic demand out of the world and especially the Western economies. And in fact, the world economy has not recovered from the deflation that it's experienced in that time, in the 1970s. But this was not just a period of economic stagnation, it was also a period of inflation. I mean, the governments had realized that they had this recipe which was throw money at problems, but in the course of the 1970s it became clear that by throwing more money at problems, often money that was simply created out of nothing, they fueled inflation. Now, so that in 1975, for example, the average, the global rate of of inflation was 15%, and in Britain it was something like 25%. I don't know if you know that in 1976 Britain was rescued by the IMF because its macroeconomy was in tatters. I mean, it was like, you know, we were in Argentina in 1976.